Sometimes the people who gave us everything are left with nothing. Sometimes those who fed us when we were hungry are forgotten when their own bellies ache. Rurik Skallgrimsson was the fiercest Viking warrior of his time. He had conquered enemies across distant lands and earned his place in legend. But when he returned to his village, he found something that broke his heart. Behind a crumbling hut sat old Sigrid, the blacksmith's widow. She was eating scraps, forgotten by everyone she had once helped. When this giant of a man saw her tears, everything changed. This is the story of how one act of remembrance transformed an entire village forever. What would make the most feared Viking warrior kneel before a helpless old woman? Before we begin, tell us where you're listening from, and if this story moves you, subscribe because tomorrow brings something extraordinary. The dragon-headed longship cut through the grey waters of the fjord, like a blade through silk, its carved serpent eyes gleaming in the pale autumn sun. Rurik Skallgrimsson stood at the prow, his massive frame casting a shadow across the deck, where 30 battle-hardened warriors sat in respectful silence. The raid on the western monasteries had been their most successful yet, chests overflowing with silver, bolts of fine cloth, and enough grain to feed half the village through winter. Yet as familiar peaks rose from the mist ahead, Rurik felt an emptiness that no amount of plunder could fill. At 43 winters, he had sailed farther than any man in living memory, his name whispered in fear from the Irish shores to the Frankish coasts. Kingdoms had paid tribute rather than face his wrath. Poets sang of his deeds in halls across the northern world. But standing there, watching his homeland emerge from the sea spray, he wondered what it all meant. The village of Ironfjord nestled between towering cliffs like a child in its mother's arms. Smoke rose from 24 homes, their timber walls weathered silver by countless storms. The great hall dominated the settlement's heart, its carved beams reaching toward the sky like the ribs of some ancient beast. Beyond it, smaller dwellings clustered around workshops and storage buildings, while fishing boats bobbed in the protected harbor like sleeping ducks. Rurik had been born in the meanest hut of all, a ramshackle shelter near the village edge where his mother had died, bringing him into the world. His father, whoever that might have been, had never claimed him. By his 5th winter, he was little more than a stray dog, begging scraps and sleeping wherever he could find shelter from the wind. That was when Bjorn the blacksmith and his wife Sigrid had found him. The memory rose unbidden as the ship glided toward shore. He could still feel Sigrid's gentle hands cleaning the dirt from his face, her voice soft as summer rain as she led him to their small but warm home behind the forge. Bjorn had been a bear of a man, all muscle and sinew from years at the anvil, but his heart was larger than his powerful frame. They had no children of their own, though they'd tried for many years. Every soul has value, Sigrid had told him that first night, wrapping him in the finest woolen blanket he'd ever touched. The gods don't make mistakes, even when we can't see their purpose. For 3 years he had known what it meant to belong somewhere. Bjorn taught him the mysteries of metal and fire, showing him how raw iron could be shaped into tools that would outlast their makers. Sigrid filled his stomach with thick porridge and his ears with stories of heroes and distant lands. She mended his clothes and tended his scraped knees with the same care she might have shown a prince. But prosperity had been fleeting for a blacksmith's family. When the old chieftain died and his son Thorvald took power, new laws favored the wealthy landowners. Taxes doubled, then doubled again. Bjorn was forced to sell his best tools to feed them through a harsh winter, and eventually even their kindness couldn't stretch to feed an extra mouth. Rurik had understood, even at 8 years old. The night they sat him down to explain, tears streaming down Sigrid's weathered cheeks, he had simply nodded and gathered his few possessions. He bore them no anger. How could he? They had given him more love in 3 years than most children received in a lifetime. "You'll always be our boy," Sigrid had whispered, pressing a small iron pendant into his palm, a crude hammer that Bjorn had forged especially for him. "When you're grown and strong, you remember us." He had kept that pendant through everything that followed, through the years of scrambling for survival on the village edges, through his first raid at 16, when desperation and fury had made him the fiercest fighter on the battlefield, through his rise to leadership of his own crew, then his own fleet. It hung around his neck still, hidden beneath mail and fur, the only link to the boy who had once known unconditional love. Now, as his ship approached the familiar docks, Rurik found himself thinking not of the glory he'd won or the wealth he'd accumulated, but of that crude little hammer and the woman who had pressed it into his hand with such tenderness. The village had changed in his absence. New buildings rose where modest homes once stood, their walls gleaming with fresh timber and iron fittings. The harbor bristled with merchant vessels alongside the usual fishing boats. Trade had clearly flourished. Well-dressed men strolled the docks, their clothes marking them as successful traders or landowners. Everything spoke of prosperity and growth. But something felt different. The faces he saw lacked the warmth he remembered from his youth. People hurried past each other with barely a nod, their expressions focused on their own concerns. The easy camaraderie that had once defined village life seemed to have faded, replaced by a sort of competitive efficiency. As his crew secured the longship, Rurik barely heard their excited chatter about the ale they'd drink and the stories they'd tell. His thoughts were fixed on a small forge near the village's edge, where smoke had once risen daily from Bjorn's fire. Would he find the old blacksmith still at his anvil, grey-bearded but steady-handed? Would Sigrid still tend her small garden, her face lighting up at the sight of an unexpected visitor? He made his excuses to his men, promising to join them later in the great hall. For now, he needed to walk alone through the streets of his childhood to see what time and prosperity had wrought in the place that had shaped him. His footsteps echoed off the wooden walkways as he made his way through the village center, past shops and homes that seemed both familiar and strangely foreign. The forge stood where it always had, but no smoke rose from its chimney. The building looked smaller than he remembered, its timber walls gray with age and neglect. Weeds grew between the stones of the yard, where Bjorn had once sorted iron and coal. The great anvil sat silent under a covering of dust and fallen leaves. Behind the forge, the small home where he had known his only taste of family happiness squatted like a wounded animal. Its roof sagged in places, and gaps showed between the wall timbers where the chinking had fallen away. No light showed in the windows, no smoke rose from the hearth-hole. Rurik stood for a long moment, studying the abandoned homestead. Perhaps Bjorn and Sigrid had prospered as the village had, moving to one of the fine new houses near the harbor. Perhaps they had family now, children to care for them in their declining years. Perhaps. A soft sound reached his ears from somewhere behind the hut, a quiet, broken sobbing that made his warrior's heart clench with unexpected pain. Moving carefully, he rounded the corner of the building and stopped dead in his tracks. There, huddled on a wooden stump beside the cold forge, sat an old woman in a threadbare cloak. Her gray hair hung in thin wisps around a face carved deep with lines of hardship and sorrow. In her lap sat a cracked wooden bowl containing what looked like dried fish bones and crumbs of dark bread. Her thin shoulders shook as quiet tears fell onto the meager scraps. It took Rurik several heartbeats to recognize her, the woman who had once seemed so strong and capable, whose laughter had filled their little home like sunlight, had become a fragile shadow. But the gentle curve of her mouth remained the same, and when she looked up at his approaching footsteps, he saw the same kind eyes that had watched over his childhood dreams. "Sigrid," he breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. She stared at him for a moment, confusion clouding her features. Then recognition dawned slowly, like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Her hand flew to her mouth as fresh tears began to fall. Rurik! My little Rurik! In that moment, the fiercest Viking raider of his generation forgot everything about glory and conquest and the respect of warriors. He saw only the woman who had loved him when no one else would, reduced to eating scraps behind the ruins of her former happiness. Something deep in his chest broke open like a dam giving way to floodwaters. Without a word, he dropped to one knee in the muddy yard and bowed his head before the woman who had once called him son. The tears in Sigrid's eyes fell like rain on parched earth as she stared at the kneeling giant before her. Her weathered hands trembled as she reached out tentatively, as if afraid he might vanish like a dream. "You've grown so tall," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "So strong, just as Bjorn always said you would." Rurik raised his head slowly, taking in every line of suffering etched into her beloved face. The woman who had once seemed ageless in his child's eyes now appeared fragile as autumn leaves. Her clothes, though clean, were patched and worn thin. Her fingers, which had once been plump and quick with needle and thread, were now bony and marked with the tremor of age and hunger. "Where is Bjorn?" he asked gently, though something in her expression already told him the answer. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Gone these 5 winters past, his heart gave out one morning at the forge. He was mending a plough blade for old Gunnar's son. She touched the rusted hammer that lay beside her wooden bowl. Bjorn's favorite tool, worn smooth by decades of faithful use. He spoke your name at the end. Wondered if you were still alive, still sailing the western seas. Rurik's massive hands clenched into fists as grief and rage warred in his chest. Bjorn, steady, gentle Bjorn, who had taught him that strength could be used to build rather than destroy, was gone. The man who had shown him how to shape raw iron into something useful and beautiful would never again hear the ring of hammer on anvil. "I should have been here," Rurik said, his voice thick with guilt. "I should have—" "Hush now." Sigrid's tone carried an echo of the authority she'd once wielded when scolding him for tracking mud across her clean floors. "You had your own life to live. Bjorn understood that. We both did." But as Rurik looked around at the crumbling homestead, at her threadbare clothing and bowl of scraps, understanding crashed over him like a cold wave. "What happened, Sigrid? Where is everyone? Surely the village cares for its widows?" A bitter smile touched her lips. "The village has changed, my dear boy. People look after their own now, and I—" She gestured helplessly at the decaying buildings around them. "I have no own to speak of. What about your nephew Eric, the merchant's son who used to visit? Eric has his own family now, his own concerns. He sends what he can spare, when he can spare it, but that's not often." She straightened her shoulders with a dignity that broke his heart. "I don't ask. For charity, Rurik. I never have." "This isn't charity," he said fiercely. "This is family." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Sigrid's eyes widened as if she'd forgotten what that word could mean. "Tell me," Rurik said, settling cross-legged on the ground before her like he used to do as a child when she would tell him stories. "Tell me how you came to be eating scraps behind your own home." Sigrid was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently stroking Bjorn's hammer. When she spoke, her voice was steady but filled with a weariness that went bone deep. "When Bjorn died, I thought I could manage. The forge had always provided enough, and I had some savings tucked away, but the new chieftain, Magnus, he's young Thorvald's son, he has different ideas about how the village should work." Rurik's jaw tightened. He remembered Magnus as a spoiled boy who delighted in tormenting smaller children. Magnus decided that prime land near the harbor was too valuable to waste on a widow's garden. He offered to buy this plot for what he called a fair price, barely enough to rent a corner room in someone else's house. When I refused, things became difficult. Difficult how? The tax assessments grew steeper each season. Suddenly, every minor repair needed official approval and fees. The village council, all Magnus's friends, found reasons to fine me for supposed violations. Keeping pigs too close to the well. Forge smoke bothering the neighbors, even though the forge hadn't been lit since Bjorn died. Rurik felt his warrior's rage building, but he forced himself to listen calmly. I sold what I could, Sigrid continued. Bjorn's good tools first, then his weapons, then our few pieces of silver. Each time I thought it would be enough to satisfy them, but there was always another fine, another tax, another reason I owed the village more than I could pay. Where was the law? Where was justice? Sigrid's laugh held no humor. Magnus is the law now. His word carries the weight of ancient custom, or so he claims. And who would speak for an old woman with no family, no influence, no coins to grease the right palms? I would, Rurik said quietly, and the menace in his voice made even the gentle Sigrid shiver. But you weren't here, dear one. No one was. She reached out and touched his cheek with one thin finger. So I did what I had to do. I gave up the house. Magnus was kind enough to let me stay in the old storage shed behind it. I tend a few vegetables in the patch of ground they allow me, and she gestured at the bowl of scraps. I make do with what I can find. Find? You mean beg? I prefer to think of it as accepting kindness, she said with forced lightness. Young Astrid sometimes has extra fish from her husband's nets. Old Gunnar remembers the plowshares Bjorn mended for his father. They share what they can spare. Rurik stared at the bowl in her lap. Fish bones picked clean, bread so stale it had turned dark, a few withered roots that might once have been carrots. This was what remained of the woman who had saved his life, who had given him the only taste of family love he'd ever known. Do you remember, Sigrid said softly, the night you first came to us? You were so thin, so frightened. Bjorn found you sleeping in the woodpile, trying to stay warm. Of course he remembered. The terror, the bone-deep cold, the certainty that he would die alone and forgotten. I made you porridge, she continued. You ate 3 bowls and fell asleep at our table. When you woke the next morning, you looked at me and asked, am I allowed to stay? Rurik's throat felt tight. You said, I said, as long as you need to, little one. As long as you need to. Her voice broke slightly. I meant it then, and I mean it still. Then why? He gestured at the squalor around them. Why didn't you seek me out? Send word. I have gold, Sigrid. I have influence. I could have... Could have what? Abandoned your life to care for an old woman's problems. You had destinies to fulfill, adventures to live. I would not burden you with my troubles. Burden me? Rurik's voice rose dangerously. You think caring for the woman who saved my soul would be a burden? Sigrid flinched at his tone, and he immediately softened it, ashamed of himself. This gentle woman had endured enough harsh words. You gave me everything, he said quietly. Hope when I had none. Purpose when I was lost. Love when I was unlovable. And I let you waste away to nothing while I played at being a hero in distant lands. Oh, my dear boy. Sigrid's eyes filled with fresh tears. You were never unlovable, not for a single moment. Rurik reached for her hands, marveling at how small and frail they felt in his warrior's grasp. These hands had fed him, clothed him, comforted him when nightmares drove him from sleep. They had worked tirelessly at loom and garden and hearth to make a home for a foundling child who owed them nothing. Now they shook with hunger and age, and it was his fault for being too consumed with his own glory to remember what truly mattered. This ends now, he said, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded fleets and conquered fortresses. I don't care what Magnus thinks he owns or what laws he's twisted to suit his greed. You will never want for anything again. Sigrid pulled her hands free gently. Rurik, I cannot... You can. You will. He rose to his feet, his massive frame blocking out the sun. I failed you once by not being here when you needed me. I will not fail you again. As he stood there, looking down at the woman who had shaped his heart when he was too young to understand its value, Rurik Skallgrimsson felt something shift deep in his chest. All his victories, all his wealth, all the fear his name commanded across 3 kingdoms. None of it meant anything if he couldn't protect the people who had loved him first. The age of conquest was ending. The age of reckoning had begun. Rurik's first instinct was to solve the problem as he had solved every other challenge in his life, with overwhelming force and precious metal. From his ship's cargo hold, he retrieved a silver arm ring thick as a man's thumb, wrought by the finest craftsmen in Dublin and worth more than most villagers would see in 5 years. He found Sigrid where he had left her, still clutching Bjorn's hammer as if it were her last anchor to better days. When he knelt before her and held out the gleaming silver band, her eyes widened with something that looked more like alarm than gratitude. "This will buy you anything you need," he said earnestly. "A proper house, warm clothes, food enough to last through 3 winters. Take it." Sigrid stared at the arm ring without touching it. The silver caught the afternoon light, casting bright reflections across her weathered features. For a long moment, she was silent. "It's beautiful," she said finally, "but I cannot accept it." "Cannot?" Rurik's brow furrowed in confusion. "Sigrid, this is the solution to all your troubles. With this much silver, I would become a target for every greedy man in the village." Her voice was gentle but firm. "They would say I stole it or earned it through shameful means. And even if they believed it was freely given, do you think Magnus would let me keep it? He would find some law, some tax, some fine that would strip it from me within a moon's turning." Rurik felt a flash of irritation. Why was she making this so difficult? "Then I'll buy you a house outright. I'll purchase land in another village where Magnus has no power. And leave the only home I've ever known. Leave Bjorn's grave." Sigrid shook her head sadly. "You mean well, dear boy, but you cannot understand. This isn't about having enough silver. This is about having no place in the world anymore." The word boy stung more than Rurik cared to admit. Here he was, a man whose name was spoken with reverence and fear across the known world, being gently corrected like a child who didn't understand how adults conducted themselves. But as his anger cooled, he began to see the wisdom in her words. Wealth alone wouldn't restore her dignity or her place in the community. If anything, it might make her situation worse by marking her as an outsider with suspicious resources. "Then what do you need?" he asked, sliding the arm ring back into his purse. "Tell me what would truly help." Sigrid smiled sadly. "What I need, my dear Rurik, is to matter again, to have a purpose beyond merely surviving. But that is not something silver can buy." Her words haunted him as he walked through the village that evening, seeing it with new eyes. The prosperity he had admired upon his arrival now seemed hollow, built upon a foundation of individual greed rather than community strength. People hurried past each other without acknowledgement, their faces set in expressions of calculation and self-interest. At the great hall, Magnus held court with his circle of wealthy followers. Rurik watched from the shadows as the young chieftain, barely 30 winters and soft from a life of inherited privilege, spoke dismissively of the village's outdated obligations to support those who could no longer contribute. "The world is changing," Magnus declared, his voice carrying the confidence of youth. "We must adapt or be left behind. Sentiment is a luxury we can no longer afford." His companions nodded sagely, their own prosperity built on similar philosophies. They were merchants and landowners, men who had accumulated wealth by seeing every interaction as a transaction to be optimized. "What about the old customs?" asked Thorkel, an older man who had known Magnus's father. "The traditions that say we care for our elders?" Magnus waved dismissively. "Tradition is a chain around our necks. Look at the coastal settlements that still cling to ancient ways. They stagnate while we thrive. The weak must make room for the strong, or everyone suffers. Rurik's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt. It would be so easy to stride into that hall and demand justice at the edge of a blade. These soft men with their soft philosophies would not stand for long against a warrior who had carved his reputation from the bones of his enemies. But Sigrid's voice echoed in his memory. "You cannot understand." Perhaps she was right. Perhaps the solution required more than the simple application of violence he had used to solve every other problem in his life. The next morning, he sought out the village's other elders, following hints and whispers to find those who had been forgotten in the rush toward prosperity. What he discovered filled him with a cold rage that made his berserker fury seem tame by comparison. Old Gunnar, who had taught half the village's children their letters, now lived in a leaking hovel at the village's edge. His failing eyes made reading impossible, and his shaking hands could no longer hold a quill steady enough to write. The young fathers who had once begged him to educate their sons now had no time for an old man who could no longer contribute. Astrid, the wise woman whose knowledge of herbs and healing had saved countless lives, survived by trading her few remaining remedies for scraps of food. The mothers who had once sought her counsel in childbirth and sickness now preferred the traveling physicians who demanded silver but offered no judgment about their modern ways. Einar One-Eye, who had sailed with Rurik's grandfather and could navigate by the stars alone, spent his days sitting by the harbor watching ships he would never sail again. The young captains ignored his offers of guidance, claiming they had better charts and instruments than any old man's memory could provide. Each story was the same: people who had given their lives to building and protecting the community, now discarded when age made them less useful than they once had been. And in every case, Magnus and his circle had found ways to strip them of their remaining dignity and resources through legal manipulation and social pressure. By the time Rurik returned to Sigrid's hovel that evening, his understanding of the problem had grown far beyond one woman's suffering. This was a plague that had infected the entire village, turning neighbor against neighbor and children against their own grandparents. "You were right," he told her, as she offered him a cup of thin ale, probably her only refreshment, shared without hesitation. "This isn't about silver, it's about something much deeper." Sigrid nodded knowingly. "You've been visiting the others. How did you know?" "Because you have the look of a man who's seen too much truth in one day." She settled beside him on a rickety bench, her movements careful and deliberate. "It's painful, isn't it, to see how far we've fallen? In my travels, I've seen cities burn to ashes and kingdoms ground to dust," Rurik said quietly. "But I've never seen anything as ugly as this. At least in war, the enemy shows his face. Here, they smile and speak of progress while they steal the dignity from those who built everything they enjoy." "Magnus and his friends aren't evil men," Sigrid said, surprising him. "They're simply young and foolish, drunk on their own success. They mistake cruelty for wisdom and selfishness for strength. They deserve to be taught the difference. Perhaps, but not through fear or violence. That would only prove their point, that the old ways are savage and outdated." Sigrid's eyes held a spark of the intelligence that had once made her Bjorn's trusted partner in all things. "If you truly want to help, you must find a way to make them remember why the old customs existed in the first place." Rurik considered this as he walked back to his ship that night. His crew greeted him with questions about when they would divide their spoils and celebrate their victories, but their concerns seemed distant now. All his life, he had measured success by what he could take: treasure, territory, glory. Now he was faced with a different challenge entirely: how to give back what had been stolen, not through conquest, but through something more subtle and lasting. The silver arm ring felt heavy in his purse, a symbol of his failed first attempt. Tomorrow he would try again, but this time he would listen more than he spoke and think more than he acted. Sigrid had taught him that much at least. The morning brought new understanding as Rurik spent his days learning the true depth of the village's transformation. What he discovered made his warrior's blood run cold with a different kind of rage. Not the hot fury of battle, but the bitter anger of betrayal. It was old Gunnar who first mentioned Sigrid's wedding brooch, speaking of it with a reverence reserved for sacred relics. Bjorn commissioned it from the finest silversmith in the eastern settlements, the elderly teacher said, his clouded eyes distant with memory. Took him 2 seasons of extra work to afford it, but he said Sigrid deserved something beautiful for agreeing to marry a simple blacksmith. Rurik had vague memories of the piece, intricate Norse knotwork surrounding a small amber stone, delicate enough for a queen, yet sturdy enough for daily wear. Sigrid had worn it to every festival and celebration, her one piece of true finery that marked her as a woman of worth and substance. She sold it last winter, Gunnar continued sadly. Magnus's tax collectors had come 3 times in 1 month, each time finding new reasons to demand payment. The brooch was all she had left of value. That afternoon, Rurik made discreet inquiries among the village's merchants and traders. The trail led him to Hakon the goldsmith, a nervous man who worked from a shop near the harbor. When pressed, Hakon reluctantly admitted to purchasing certain items from desperate villagers, though he claimed ignorance of their sentimental value. The old woman seemed eager to sell, Hakon insisted, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. Said she needed coins for winter provisions. I offered fair market price. How much? 2 silver pieces. It was tarnished, you see, and the amber had a crack. Rurik's hand shot out, gripping the goldsmith's throat just firmly enough to stop his lies. That brooch was worth 20 silver pieces when it was new, and silver only grows more valuable with age. You cheated a hungry widow out of her most precious possession. Hakon's face went pale as snow. Please, Lord Rurik, I meant no harm. I have children to feed, a business to maintain. Where is it now? Sir's sold already, I'm afraid. To a merchant from the southern fjords. He paid handsomely for it, said it would make a fine gift for his daughter's wedding. Rurik released the man with a disgusted grunt. Another dead end, another piece of Sigrid's dignity scattered to the winds by greedy opportunists who saw her desperation as a business opportunity. But the encounter had revealed something else, a pattern of exploitation that went far beyond simple neglect. As he investigated further, Rurik discovered that Magnus and his circle had created an entire system designed to strip wealth from the vulnerable while maintaining the appearance of legality. The tax assessments that had driven Sigrid from her home were just one example. Ancient laws about property maintenance had been twisted to impose impossible standards on those least able to meet them. Fines for trivial violations were set just high enough to force the sale of precious possessions. And when desperation made people vulnerable to unfair trades, there was always someone ready to take advantage. Einar One-Eye had lost his father's navigational instruments, priceless artifacts of horn and bronze that had guided 3 generations of sailors to pay a fine for disturbing the peace after he'd raised his voice during a village assembly. Astrid the Wise Woman had been forced to sell her collection of rare healing herbs to cover penalties for unlicensed practice of medicine, even though she'd been treating the village's ailments for 40 years. Each case followed the same pattern. Find a pretext, impose a penalty, force a sale, profit from the desperation. The worst part was how legal it all appeared on the surface. Magnus's father had been a fair man, but his laws had been written in simpler times when community bonds ensured they would be applied with mercy and common sense. His son had perverted those same laws into instruments of exploitation. That evening, Rurik sought out some of his former shipmates who had remained in the village during previous raids. Men like Olaf Ironhand and Ragnar the Clever, warriors who had earned enough wealth to become landowners themselves. Surely they would understand the injustice of what was happening. "You're being sentimental, Rurik," Olaf said as they shared ale in his well-appointed home. "The village has prospered under Magnus's leadership. Trade has tripled, our defenses are stronger, and we're no longer dependent on the whims of nature for survival. At what cost, Rurik demanded. "While you feast in halls built with new timber, the people who raised us waste away in hovels." Ragnar shrugged uncomfortably. Times change. The old ways were kind, but they were also inefficient. We couldn't support everyone forever. Support them? They're the ones who supported us. Gunnar taught you to read, Ragnar. Astrid delivered your first son when the birth went wrong. Einar's navigation got us safely home from 3 raids where lesser captains would have lost their entire crews. And we're grateful, Olaf insisted. But gratitude doesn't put food on the table or defend against enemies. The village must be practical now. Rurik looked around Olaf's hall, taking in the fine tapestries and silver cups, the warm furs and well-fed servants. Practical for whom? The conversation grew heated, with old friends speaking past each other like strangers. Olaf and Ragnar saw prosperity and progress. Rurik saw betrayal and forgotten loyalty. They viewed the suffering of the elders as an unfortunate but necessary consequence of advancement. He saw it as a moral failing that poisoned everything it touched. "You've grown soft in your success," Ragnar accused finally. "One old woman's tears, and you want to drag the entire village back to the old ways." "One old woman who saved my life," Rurik replied coldly. "But even if she meant nothing to me, would that make her suffering acceptable? When did we become the kind of people who abandon those who can no longer fight for themselves?" The evening ended in strained silence, with old bonds of brotherhood stretched to the breaking point. Rurik walked through the village streets afterward, noting how many fine new houses belonged to men who had once called him friend. They had all prospered under the new order, which perhaps explained their willingness to overlook its costs. But not everyone had forgotten their obligations. Over the following days, Rurik found allies among the village's more traditional families, people who still remembered when community meant more than individual advancement. Sven the shipwright, whose grandfather had built vessels for 3 generations of raiders. Helga Ravenscraft, the baker who still insisted on providing bread for those who couldn't afford it. Young Thorvald, named for Magnus's grandfather, who had been horrified to learn how his childhood friend's grandparents were being treated. These were not wealthy people by the village's new standards, but they commanded respect for their skills and their integrity. More importantly, they remembered what the village had been like before Magnus's improvements had divided it into winners and losers. "The problem isn't Magnus himself," Sven explained as they worked together to repair the roof of Astrid's hovel. "He's young and misguided, but not truly evil. The problem is that he's surrounded himself with advisors who profit from the current system. They whisper in his ear that harsh measures are necessary for progress, while their own wealth grows from others' misery. Then we must find a way to open his ears to different voices," Rurik mused. "But how do we compete with advisors who tell him what he wants to hear?" The answer came to him slowly, like dawn breaking over the mountains. Magnus and his circle had convinced themselves that the old ways were outdated and inefficient. But what if Rurik could demonstrate that the opposite was true, that a community united in mutual support was stronger than one divided by competition? It would require more than charity or confrontation. It would require a fundamental shift in how the village understood strength, success, and honor. And it would start with convincing one proud old woman to let him give back what had been taken from her, not as charity, but as justice. In the dusty corners of Gunnar's hovel, Rurik found what he was seeking, a collection of carved wooden tablets that recorded the village's ancient laws and customs. The old teacher's failing eyes could no longer read the runes, but his memory remained sharp as forged steel when it came to their meaning. "The mead horn of honor," Gunnar explained, running his gnarled fingers over the carved symbols. "It was your grandfather's grandfather who established the custom. Every harvest festival, the horn would be passed among the elders first, acknowledging their wisdom and contributions. No feast could begin until they had been properly honored." Rurik studied the tablet with growing excitement. "Where is this horn now?" "Gathering dust in Magnus's storehouse, I imagine. He declared the ceremony archaic 3 winters ago, said it slowed the festivities and made the younger generation uncomfortable. The irony was bitter as old ale. Magnus commanded respect through fear and legal authority, while dismissing the very customs that had once bound the community together through genuine reverence for its eldest members. Over the following days, Rurik immersed himself in the village's forgotten traditions. He discovered that the ancient laws contained provisions for elder care that had been selectively ignored rather than formally abolished. The concept of skuldgird, the debt of honor owed to those who had built the community, was woven throughout the oldest legal codes. Every craftsman who trains an apprentice creates a bond that extends beyond the learning, Gunnar explained as they pored over another tablet. Every warrior who protects the village earns the right to protection in his declining years. Every mother who raises children who contribute to the community has established a claim on their prosperity. But these laws are still in effect, Rurik realized. Magnus hasn't changed them. He's simply chosen not to enforce them. Precisely. And that means they can be invoked by anyone with the authority to demand their application. Rurik's reputation as a successful raider gave him significant standing in village affairs, though he had never chosen to exercise it before. Unlike Magnus, whose authority came from inherited position, Rurik commanded respect through proven accomplishment. The men who followed him into battle trusted his judgment, and their families trusted them. His first attempt to rally support came during the evening meal at the Great Hall. Rising to address the assembled villagers, Rurik spoke of the old customs with the same passion he had once reserved for battle speeches. "We honor our weapons because they have served us faithfully," he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "We maintain our ships because they have carried us safely through storms, yet we abandon our elders, who have served us far longer and more faithfully than any tool or vessel." The response was mixed. Some of the older villagers nodded approval, remembering when such words would have been met with universal agreement. But many of the younger families seemed uncomfortable with his message, shifting in their seats and avoiding his gaze. Magnus himself listened with the polite attention of a leader who had no intention of changing course. When Rurik finished, the young chieftain rose with a practiced smile. "Lord Rurik honors us with his presence and his words," Magnus said smoothly. "But we must be practical about our obligations. The village cannot prosper if we chain ourselves to outdated sentimentality." The hall erupted in murmured conversations as people debated the competing philosophies. Rurik could see the division clearly now. Those who had prospered under Magnus's leadership defended his approach, while those who remembered the old bonds felt torn between tradition and self-interest. After the formal gathering ended, several villagers approached Rurik privately. Helga the baker spoke for many when she whispered, "Your words ring true, Lord Rurik, but what can we do? Magnus controls the law, and those who oppose him find their own troubles multiplying." It was young Thorvald who provided the key insight. "My grandfather often spoke of the Thing, the ancient assembly where all free men could voice their concerns and demand justice. Has that custom been abolished as well?" Gunnar's eyes lit up with sudden hope. "The Thing cannot be abolished. It's older than any chieftain's authority. It predates even the settlement of this fjord. Any village member can call for assembly if they have evidence of injustice." But calling for a Thing was not a step to be taken lightly. It would force a direct confrontation with Magnus's authority and require Rurik to present not just complaints, but solutions. More challenging still, it would need the support of enough villagers to make the assembly legitimate in the eyes of the community. Rurik began visiting homes throughout the village, speaking quietly with families who remembered better times. He found unexpected allies among the craftsmen whose skills had been undervalued by Magnus's focus on trade and agriculture. Sven the shipwright had seen his requests for apprentices denied because shipbuilding was less profitable than importing vessels from southern settlements. Eric the Potter had been forced to compete with cheap imported goods while receiving no protection for his superior local craftsmanship. "The boy sees only silver and trade goods," Sven muttered as he showed Rurik the inferior construction of a recently purchased trading vessel. "He doesn't understand that skills die when they're not passed down. In 10 years, we'll be completely dependent on others for things our grandfathers made with pride." Each conversation revealed another aspect of how the village's transformation was hollowing out its foundations. The focus on immediate profit had led to the abandonment of long-term thinking. Traditional crafts were dying as young people pursued quicker paths to wealth. The bonds of mutual obligation that had once made the community resilient were fraying under the pressure of individual competition. But perhaps most importantly, Rurik discovered that Sigrid's situation was not unique. Nearly every family had an elder who had been marginalized or forgotten in the rush toward prosperity. The difference was that most people had learned to accept it as an inevitable consequence of progress. "My father built half the houses in this village," confided Astrid the wise woman as she and Rurik prepared herbal remedies for the other forgotten elders. But when he could no longer swing a hammer, his own apprentices called him a burden. Now he sits by the window, watching younger men repair his work with inferior materials. "Why don't you speak for him at the village assembly?" Astrid's laugh held bitter wisdom. "Women's voices carry little weight in Magnus's assembly, and old women's voices carry none at all. We learned quickly to keep our concerns to ourselves." This revelation opened Rurik's eyes to yet another dimension of the problem. The traditional thing had always recognized the voices of all free people, including women who held property or practiced essential crafts. But Magnus's version of governance had gradually excluded anyone who didn't contribute directly to his vision of prosperity. As the days passed, Rurik found himself thinking often of the ancient mead horn gathering dust in Magnus's storehouse. It represented more than ceremony. It embodied the idea that wisdom increased with age, that experience deserved honor, and that a community's strength came from embracing all its members rather than discarding the inconvenient ones. The solution would require more than invoking old laws or shaming people into better behavior. It would require demonstrating that the traditional ways were not merely kind, but practical, that a village united in mutual support was stronger than one divided by competition. And it would begin with returning that mead horn to its rightful place at the head of every table, where the eldest voices would be heard first and honored most. The unfinished blade lay on Bjorn's cold anvil, like a promise broken by death. Rurik ran his fingers along the rough-forged metal, feeling the texture of work interrupted in its prime. The steel showed the master craftsman's touch, perfectly balanced despite its incomplete state, with the subtle curves that would have made it sing through the air. "He was making it for Magnus," Sigrid explained quietly, standing beside him in the abandoned forge. "A wedding gift for the young chieftain's bride." Bjorn spent weeks selecting the metal, folding it over and over to create the perfect strength. He said it would be his finest work. The irony cut deeper than any blade. Here was proof of Bjorn's generous heart, spending his final months creating a masterpiece for the same man who would later drive his widow into poverty. The unfinished weapon stood as testament to interrupted legacy, to the countless skills and kindnesses that died with their makers. "Magnus never claimed it," Sigrid continued. "After Bjorn passed, I offered to have another smith complete the work, but Magnus said he had already purchased a blade from southern traders. Something finer than local craftsmanship could provide." Rurik's jaw clenched at the casual dismissal of a master's final gift. This single blade represented everything wrong with the village's new values: the rejection of local skill in favor of imported goods, the abandonment of personal relationships for cold commerce, the inability to recognize the love that had gone into its making. Over the following days, Rurik made regular visits to each of the forgotten elders, learning their stories with the patience of a man who finally understood what truly mattered. Old Gunnar shared memories of teaching Magnus himself to read and write, patiently correcting the boy's clumsy letters and encouraging his scholarly pursuits. The same man now struggled to afford fuel for his fire, while his former student lived in luxury. Einar One-Eye spoke of guiding Magnus's father through treacherous waters during a crucial trading mission, his expertise saving not just lives, but the entire foundation of the village's current prosperity. Yet when age clouded his vision and stiffened his joints, his contributions were forgotten in favor of younger navigators with newer instruments. Astrid the Wise Woman had delivered Magnus into the world during a difficult birth that nearly claimed both mother and child. Her skill and knowledge had saved the very life that now held power over hers. But her healing arts were deemed primitive compared to the traveling physicians who demanded silver for services she had always provided from love of her community. Each story revealed the same pattern. People who had given everything for the village's well-being now treated as burdens rather than treasures. And in every case, Magnus himself had been a direct beneficiary of their sacrifices, though he seemed to have forgotten those debts entirely. But Rurik also discovered something else during his visits. These elders were far from the helpless victims he had initially imagined. Their bodies might be failing, but their minds remained sharp as winter wind. Gunnar could still recite the genealogies of every family in the village, knowledge that had prevented inheritance disputes for 3 generations. Astrid's understanding of herbs and healing was deeper than any traveling physician's, refined by decades of practical experience. Einar could read weather patterns and seasonal changes that no instrument could detect. The village was throwing away irreplaceable wisdom in its rush to embrace imported solutions. "We need to show them what they're losing," Rurik said during one of his evening conversations with Sigrid. "Not just tell them, show them." Sigrid smiled with something approaching her old warmth. "You're beginning to think like Bjorn used to. He always said the best way to prove a blade's worth was to let it speak for itself in battle." That gave Rurik an idea. What if the elders could demonstrate their continued value in ways that even Magnus couldn't ignore? The opportunity came sooner than expected. Young Thorvald arrived at Sigrid's hut one evening with troubling news. A merchant ship ran aground on the hidden rocks near Seal Point. The captain claims his charts show deep water, but 3 men are dead and their cargo lost. Rurik knew those rocks well. They were marked on no southern chart, visible only to those who had learned the local waters through years of careful observation. Einar had warned him about them during his youth. Knowledge passed down from navigator to navigator since the first settlers had explored these fjords. "Where was the village pilot?" Rurik asked. "Magnus dismissed him last spring," Thorvald replied bitterly. "Said the harbor fees paid for imported charts that were more accurate than old fishermen's tales." The next morning, Rurik sought out Einar and several other experienced sailors. Together, they began creating new maps of the local waters, combining traditional knowledge with Einar's unmatched understanding of tides, currents, and seasonal changes. When Magnus sent men to question their activities, Rurik simply pointed to the wrecked merchant vessel. "Your southern charts killed 3 men," he said bluntly. "These men's knowledge could have saved them." The mapping project attracted attention throughout the village. Younger sailors, initially skeptical of the old men's claims, found themselves impressed by the depth and accuracy of their knowledge. Charts that showed only the surface features of the coast were enriched with information about underwater hazards, seasonal variations, and weather patterns that could mean the difference between safe passage and disaster. Meanwhile, Astrid began treating the injured survivors from the shipwreck. Her herbal remedies proved more effective than the traveling physician's expensive treatments, and she charged nothing for her services. Word spread quickly through the village about her skill and generosity, reminding people of what they had lost when they'd embraced imported medicine over local wisdom. Gunnar, despite his failing eyesight, began resolving a property dispute that had festered for months under Magnus's administration. His encyclopedic knowledge of family histories and ancient boundaries cut through the confusion that modern record-keeping had created, offering solutions that satisfied both parties and strengthened community bonds. But it was Sven the shipwright who provided the most dramatic demonstration. When the village's newest trading vessel, purchased at great expense from southern craftsmen, developed dangerous leaks during its maiden voyage, Sven was the only one who understood how to repair the unfamiliar construction. Working alongside the forgotten elders, he not only saved the ship but identified fundamental design flaws that would have led to its eventual loss. "These southern builders care only about appearance and speed," he explained to the gathered crowd as he supervised the repairs. "They've forgotten that a ship must first be seaworthy. Our grandfathers built vessels that lasted generations because they understood that true craftsmanship serves function before fashion." Each success built momentum for Rurik's cause, but it also hardened Magnus's resistance. The young chieftain had staked his authority on the superiority of modern methods over traditional wisdom. Every demonstration of the elders' continued value undermined his philosophies and threatened his position. The confrontation came to a head when Magnus accused Rurik of deliberately sabotaging village progress. Standing before a hastily assembled crowd, the chieftain declared that the recent attention to outdated practices was dividing the community and threatening its prosperity. "Lord Rurik seeks to drag us backward," Magnus proclaimed, his voice carrying the authority of inherited position. "He would have us abandon everything we've built to coddle those who can no longer contribute to our success." Rurik rose slowly, his massive frame commanding attention without effort. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet confidence of a man who had finally found his true purpose. "I seek only to remind us of who we are," he said simply. "A people who honor their debts and protect those who protected them. A community that understands wisdom is more valuable than silver, and loyalty more precious than profit." The crowd murmured approval, but Magnus wasn't finished. Pretty words from a man who spent his life taking from others, rather than building anything lasting. What gives a raider the right to lecture us about community values? The insult hit home, and for a moment Rurik felt the old rage rising in his chest. But then he caught sight of Sigrid's face in the crowd, her eyes bright with faith and encouragement, and the anger transformed into something deeper and more powerful. "You're right," he said, surprising everyone, including Magnus. "I spent my life taking what others had built, but these elders, they spent their lives building what we have taken for granted. Perhaps it's time I learned the difference between conquest and creation." The words hung in the air between them, a challenge that went far beyond mere politics to touch the very heart of what the village had become. The discovery came by accident, as the most damning revelations often do. Rurik was helping Astrid sort through her late husband's belongings when his fingers closed around a leather pouch hidden beneath loose floorboards. Inside lay documents that made his blood run cold. Property transfers, tax assessments, and legal declarations that told a story far darker than simple neglect. "These papers," Astrid whispered, her face pale as winter sky. "They show my cottage was sold to Magnus 3 seasons ago, but I never agreed to any sale. I never signed anything." Rurik studied the documents with growing horror. The signature at the bottom bore Astrid's name, but the handwriting was clearly different from the woman's own careful script. More damning still, the transfer had occurred on a date when Astrid had been bedridden with fever, a fact that half the village could verify. "This is forgery," Rurik said quietly. "Magnus has been stealing property through false documents." But this was only the beginning. Over the next 2 days, Rurik and his allies conducted a careful search of records and testimonies. What they uncovered was a systematic campaign of fraud that had been operating for years under the cover of legal authority. Old Gunnar's cottage, the one where he had taught 3 generations of children, had supposedly been donated to the village for back taxes. But the amount claimed was far beyond what any reasonable assessment would have demanded. and the donation document bore a signature that didn't match any of Gunnar's known writing. Einar's fishing boat had been purchased by Magnus's cousin for a sum that existed only on paper. The one-eyed navigator had never received payment, yet legal documents claimed the transaction was completed and consensual. Even Sigrid's gradual impoverishment followed the same pattern. Her property taxes had been inflated through false assessments. Then, when she couldn't pay the impossible amounts, her possessions had been seized and sold at prices far below their actual value. The buyers were always the same small circle of Magnus's allies, who later resold the items at significant profit. But the most shocking discovery came when young Thorvald brought them a wooden chest he had found hidden in his grandfather's old storage room. Inside were drafts of forged documents in Magnus's own hand, practice attempts at mimicking the signatures of various village elders. "He's been planning this for years," Thorvald said, his voice shaking with anger and disbelief. "My own kinsman, stealing from the people who raised him." The forged document that served as their key piece of evidence was particularly damning, a false deed claiming that Sigrid had willingly sold her home and forge to Magnus for a fraction of their value, complete with her forged signature and a fabricated witness mark. The real Sigrid had never seen the document until Rurik placed it in her trembling hands. "I remember that day," she said slowly. "Magnus came to visit, very concerned about my welfare. He asked me to sign a document that he claimed would ensure I received proper care from the village. I was so grateful for his kindness that I signed without reading it carefully." "What did the document actually say?" "That I was requesting the village to take responsibility for my housing and care, since I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. I thought it was a formal request for assistance." Her voice broke slightly. "I never imagined it would be used to justify taking my home." The scope of the fraud was staggering. Magnus hadn't simply neglected his duty to care for the village elders. He had actively exploited their trust and vulnerability to enrich himself and his circle. Property worth hundreds of silver pieces had been stolen through forged documents and manipulated legal proceedings. But perhaps most damning of all was the discovery that the scheme extended beyond their own village. Among the hidden papers were correspondence with officials in neighboring settlements, sharing techniques for legally transferring elder property to younger, more productive owners. Magnus had been teaching other chieftains how to systematically rob their own people while maintaining the appearance of lawful governance. "This isn't just greed," Rurik realized as he studied the network of correspondence. "It's a calculated plan to remake Norse society itself. They're trying to eliminate the traditional bonds between generations, replacing them with pure economic relationships." The implications were terrifying. If this system spread throughout the northern settlements, it would destroy the very foundations of their culture. The wisdom of ages would be lost, the bonds of family and community severed, and the vulnerable left to die in the pursuit of efficiency and profit. Sven the shipwright summed up what they were all thinking. This isn't about progress or necessity. It's theft on a scale that would make the most ruthless raiders look honorable by comparison. That evening, Rurik called together his closest allies to plan their response. The evidence was overwhelming, but confronting Magnus directly would be dangerous. The young chieftain controlled the village's official mechanisms of justice, and his supporters had grown wealthy from the fraud. They would not surrender their gains without a fight. "We could present the evidence at the next village assembly," suggested Helga the baker. "Surely when people see the truth—" "Magnus controls the assembly," Einar interrupted. "He could declare the documents false, claim we forged them ourselves. Who would believe an old navigator and a foreign raider over their elected chieftain?" Gunnar nodded gravely. "We need something more than evidence. We need justice that cannot be denied or dismissed." It was Sigrid who provided the answer, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "The ancient laws speak of the Thing, the great assembly where all free people can demand justice, not Magnus's assembly, where he sets the rules, but the old gathering that predates any chieftain's authority. Rurik felt a chill of recognition. The thing was more than a legal proceeding. It was the foundation of Norse justice itself, older than kingdoms and more binding than any individual's power. But calling for such an assembly was a direct challenge to Magnus's authority, one that could lead to violence if not handled with perfect care. "If we call for a thing," he said slowly, "we must be prepared for the consequences. Magnus will not surrender power willingly, and his supporters have too much to lose to accept judgment quietly. Then we must ensure the judgment is so clear that resistance becomes impossible," Astrid said firmly. "We must present not just the evidence of his crimes, but a vision of what justice looks like." As they planned through the night, Rurik found himself thinking of Bjorn's unfinished blade, still lying on the cold anvil where death had interrupted its creation. Perhaps it was time to complete that work. Not the weapon itself, but the legacy of craftsmanship and integrity that Bjorn had tried to pass on. Magnus had forged documents to steal from the innocent. Now Rurik would forge something far more powerful. A community united in the pursuit of justice, tempered in the fire of truth and hammered into something that could not be broken by greed or fear. The age of deception was ending. The age of reckoning had begun. The ancient assembly horn had not sounded in over a generation, its bronze surface green with neglect, where it hung forgotten in Magnus's storehouse. When Rurik lifted it from its dusty shelf, the metal felt heavy with the weight of tradition and justice. This horn had called the village's ancestors to witness truth, to render judgment, and to hold their leaders accountable to laws older than any chieftain's ambition. "By the rights granted to all free men," Rurik declared as he stood before the great hall, "I call for a thing to address crimes against our people and violations of ancient law." The horn's deep, resonant call echoed off the fjord walls, summoning every villager to the traditional assembly ground outside the settlement. By custom, none could refuse the call, not even Magnus, whose face had gone pale as carved bone when he heard the ancient challenge. The 3 days of preparation that followed tested every alliance Rurik had built. Magnus's supporters worked frantically to undermine the assembly's legitimacy, claiming that foreign raiders had no right to invoke Norse law against their elected leader. They whispered that the evidence was fabricated, that disgruntled elders were being manipulated by a man whose loyalty lay with distant shores rather than local prosperity. "He's turning our own people against us," Ragnar the Clever warned during one of his visits to Rurik's ship. Despite their recent disagreements, old loyalty compelled him to offer counsel. "Magnus has convinced half the village that you're trying to seize power for yourself." Rurik spent those 3 days methodically preparing his case with the precision he had once applied to planning raids. But this time, instead of weapons and tactics, he gathered testimonies and evidence. Each forged document was carefully preserved, every witness statement recorded by Gunnar's steady hand despite his failing eyesight. The most difficult part was preparing the elders themselves to speak publicly. Years of marginalization had left them uncertain of their right to demand justice, afraid that speaking out would only bring more persecution. "What if they don't believe us?" Astrid asked as she practiced recounting her story. "What if they think we're simply bitter old people complaining about change?" "Then we'll remind them who we are," Sigrid replied with quiet dignity. She had spent the 3 days reclaiming her appearance, borrowing proper clothes from village women who remembered her kindness during their own times of need. "We are not beggars asking for charity. We are citizens demanding justice." The transformation in Sigrid was remarkable. Gone was the broken woman Rurik had found eating scraps behind her ruined home. In her place stood the dignified widow of a master craftsman, a woman who had raised orphans and tended the sick, who had contributed more to the village's welfare than Magnus had ever dreamed of achieving. But Magnus wasn't passive during those 3 days. His supporters spread counter-accusations, claiming that Rurik had stolen the documents himself, that the elders were being coached to lie, that the entire affair was a plot to destabilize the village's prosperity. They reminded people of how much wealth had flowed into the settlement under Magnus's leadership, how much their own lives had improved since abandoning the old ways. "Are you willing to throw away everything we've built for the sake of sentiment?" Magnus demanded during his own preparation sessions. "Rurik offers you nothing but a return to the poverty and uncertainty our fathers knew." The young chieftain's strategy became clear as the assembly day approached. He would frame the choice as progress versus regression, prosperity versus tradition, the future versus the past. He had wealth, legal authority, and the support of everyone who had benefited from his policies. But Rurik had something more powerful: the truth and the moral authority that came from standing with the innocent against their oppressors. The night before the assembly, Rurik sat with Sigrid in her reclaimed home, for he had quietly moved her back into the cottage that had always been rightfully hers, regardless of what Magnus's forged documents claimed. The building needed work, but it felt like a home again, with her presence filling the rooms where she and Bjorn had once lived in simple happiness. "Are you afraid?" she asked as they shared a simple meal by the hearth fire that burned for the first time in years. Rurik considered the question carefully. "Not afraid of Magnus or his supporters, but afraid of failing you. Afraid that my reputation as a raider will overshadow the justice of our cause." "You're not the same man who left this village as a boy," Sigrid observed. "That young man was driven by anger and the need to prove himself. This man," she gestured at his thoughtful expression, "this man acts from love. Love for you, for what you and Bjorn gave me when I had nothing." "No," Sigrid said gently. "Love for what's right, love for the idea that communities should protect their most vulnerable members rather than exploit them. That's a love that extends far beyond one old woman or one village." Her words carried the weight of prophecy, reminding him that this struggle was about more than settling old scores or helping forgotten friends. The fraud Magnus had perpetrated was spreading to other villages, other settlements. If it succeeded here, it would metastasize throughout the Norse lands, fundamentally changing what their culture valued and how their communities functioned. "Do you remember the first time you held Bjorn's hammer?" Sigrid asked suddenly. Rurik smiled at the memory. "I was barely strong enough to lift it. You helped me hold it steady while Bjorn showed me how to shape a nail." He said something that night that I've never forgotten. He said that the true test of a craftsman wasn't in creating something beautiful, but in creating something that would last, something that would serve its purpose long after the maker was gone. The parallel wasn't lost on him. Tomorrow's assembly wasn't just about punishing Magnus or restoring property to its rightful owners. It was about forging a precedent that would outlast them all, a demonstration that justice was stronger than greed, that communities were more than economic arrangements, that the vulnerable deserved protection rather than exploitation. "What we build tomorrow," Rurik said slowly, "it needs to be strong enough to survive the next Magnus and the one after that." "Then we'd better build it right," Sigrid replied with a smile that reminded him of the woman who had once made him feel like he belonged somewhere. Outside, the autumn wind howled through the fjord, carrying the salt tang of distant seas and the promise of winter storms. But inside the small cottage, warmed by fire and fellowship, Rurik felt a peace he had never known in all his years of conquest and glory. Tomorrow would bring the greatest battle of his life, not against foreign enemies on distant shores, but against the corruption that threatened to hollow out his own people from within. He would fight not with axe and sword, but with truth and justice and the unbreakable bonds between those who chose to stand together against darkness. Victory was far from certain. Magnus commanded wealth, position, and the support of those who profited from his policies. But Rurik had something his opponent lacked: the moral clarity that came from knowing, beyond any doubt, which side deserved to win. As the fire burned low and shadows gathered in the corners of the room, He touched the small iron hammer that still hung around his neck, Bjorn's gift to a frightened child who had needed to know he was loved. Tomorrow, he would honor that gift by ensuring that no other child would grow up in a world where love was measured by utility and compassion was called weakness. The horn would sound at dawn, calling the village to judgment, and Rurik Skallgrimsson, who had once conquered distant shores for gold and glory, would finally fight the battle that truly mattered. Dawn broke gray and cold over the assembly ground, where the entire village had gathered in response to the horn's ancient call. The traditional circle of stones marked the sacred space where Norse law held sway above any individual's authority. Chieftain or commoner, all were equal before the judgment of their peers. Magnus arrived with his supporters arrayed behind him like a shield wall, their fine clothes and confidence bearing a stark contrast to the humble garments of the elders who stood with Rurik. The young chieftain had chosen his position carefully, placing himself where the morning light would illuminate his face while casting his opponents in shadow. "My friends," Magnus began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of inherited leadership, "we gather today because certain individuals seek to undermine the prosperity we have built together. They would have you believe that progress is crime, that efficiency is evil, that looking toward the future rather than the past makes us somehow less Norse." A murmur of agreement rose from his supporters, merchants and landowners who had grown wealthy under his policies. Magnus smiled with the confidence of a man who controlled both the law and the majority of the village's economic power. "Lord Rurik," he continued, turning toward his opponent with theatrical courtesy, "has lived his life taking from others. Now he returns to our peaceful village and attempts to take from us as well. Our prosperity, our progress, our right to govern ourselves according to reason rather than sentiment." It was a masterful opening, Rurik had to admit. Magnus had positioned himself as the defender of the village's achievements, while painting Rurik as an outsider, seeking to destroy what others had built. The accusation of theft was particularly clever. It turned Rurik's reputation as a successful raider against him, while implying that his current actions were merely another form of plunder. When the assembly formally recognized Rurik's right to speak, he rose slowly, allowing his physical presence to command attention before he uttered a word. But instead of the aggressive posture Magnus had clearly expected, Rurik's demeanor was calm and respectful. "I stand before you not as a raider or conqueror," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembly ground, "but as a son of this village who owes everything he has become to the kindness of those you have forgotten." He gestured toward Sigrid, who stood with quiet dignity among the other elders. "This woman fed me when I was starving, clothed me when I was cold, gave me a home when I had none. Her husband taught me that strength could be used to build rather than destroy, that true craftsmanship serves others rather than the self." The assembled villagers listened with varying degrees of sympathy and skepticism. Some remembered young Rurik's desperate circumstances. Others saw only the wealthy warrior who now commanded their attention. "Magnus speaks of taking," Rurik continued, "so let us speak of what has been taken, not by foreign raiders, but by those who live among us." With careful ceremony, he produced the first piece of evidence, Astrid's forged property deed. Gunnar, despite his failing eyesight, read the document aloud in his strong teacher's voice, explaining how the signature had been falsified and the transaction fabricated. "This is a lie," Magnus interrupted, his composure cracking slightly. "Documents can be forged by anyone. Where is the proof that I had anything to do with this supposed crime?" Rurik's answer was young Thorvald, who stepped forward carrying the wooden chest they had discovered. From within, he produced draft after draft of forged signatures in Magnus's own hand, practice attempts at mimicking the writing of various elders. The gasps from the assembled crowd were audible as the evidence was passed from hand to hand. Here was Magnus's handwriting, unmistakably his, practicing the forged signatures that had stolen homes and possessions from the most vulnerable members of their community. "These could have been planted," Magnus said desperately, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Anyone could have written practice signatures and claimed they were mine. It was then that Sven the shipwright produced the most damning evidence of all: correspondence in Magnus's hand, discussing the fraud with officials from other villages, sharing techniques for legally transferring elder property, while maintaining the appearance of lawful governance. Unless you claim that enemies forged an entire network of letters discussing crimes across multiple settlements, Sven said grimly, your own words convict you. The mood of the assembly shifted palpably as the scope of Magnus's deception became clear. This wasn't simply a matter of neglecting traditional obligations. It was deliberate, systematic theft carried out under the cover of legal authority. But Magnus wasn't finished. Drawing on the desperation of a cornered animal, he launched into an impassioned defense that appealed directly to his supporters' self-interest. Even if these accusations were true, he declared, what would you have me do? Return to the old ways where sentiment ruled over sense? Give property back to those too old to use it productively? Bankrupt ourselves, supporting those who no longer contribute? He pointed at the gathered elders with theatrical disdain. Look at them. They are the past, and the past is dead. We are the future, prosperous, strong, free from the chains of outdated obligation. Would you throw away everything we've achieved for the sake of these relics? The words hung in the air like poison, revealing the full ugliness of Magnus's philosophy, but they also revealed his tactical error. In his desperation, he had admitted to the crimes while attempting to justify them as necessary progress. Sigrid rose slowly, her dignity intact despite Magnus's cruel words. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of lived experience and unshakable moral conviction. I am not a relic, she said simply. I am a woman who spent 30 years feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, and caring for the sick in this village. I delivered half the children here, including you, Magnus Thorvaldsson. The use of his full name invoking the memory of his father struck home visibly. Magnus had been a difficult birth, and only Astrid's skill had saved both mother and child. Everyone in the village knew the story. The hands you call useless, Sigrid continued, holding up her weathered fingers, cleaned your blood when you were born, prepared the medicines that saved your life when fever nearly claimed you at 7 winters, mended the clothes you wore when your mother was too busy with younger children to tend to such tasks. Her words painted a picture that no one could deny, the web of care and obligation that had sustained their community for generations, now being dismissed as worthless sentiment by the very people who had benefited most from its gifts. The village's ancient justice stone stood at the center of the assembly ground, its weathered surface marked with runes that predated any living memory. This was where oaths were sworn and judgments rendered, where the weight of tradition made even the most powerful bow to the will of justice. Magnus's final attempt at defense crumbled as witness after witness confirmed the pattern of exploitation. His supporters began to distance themselves as the full scope of his crimes became undeniable. The forged documents, the manipulated assessments, the systematic theft, all of it laid bare before the assembled village like a wound exposed to cleansing fire. You speak of productivity and progress, old Einar said when called to testify, his one good eye blazing with righteous anger. But what productivity is there in letting ships founder on rocks that local knowledge could have avoided? What progress is there in abandoning the wisdom that kept this village alive for generations? The crowd murmured agreement as Einar recounted the recent shipwreck, the lives lost because Magnus had dismissed traditional navigation in favor of imported charts. The dead merchants became a symbol of everything wrong with the new philosophy, the dangerous arrogance of believing that foreign solutions were always superior to local knowledge. Astrid spoke next, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. She described not just the theft of her property, but the systematic dismissal of healing knowledge that had served the community for decades. Her successful treatment of the shipwreck survivors stood in stark contrast to the expensive failures of Magnus's favored physicians. But it was Gunnar's testimony that broke Magnus's remaining support among the younger villagers. The old teacher recounted his years of service, the countless children he had taught to read and write, including Magnus himself. Then he revealed the darkest truth of all, that Magnus had known exactly whose property he was stealing, had deliberately targeted those who had no family to protect them, who had given the most to the community, and now had the least power to resist. This was not business, Gunnar said, his teacher's authority silencing even Magnus's most loyal supporters. This was betrayal of the most vicious kind, the strong preying upon those who had made them strong. Magnus rose desperately, sensing his position crumbling. "Even if mistakes were made," he pleaded, "consider what we have built. The prosperity, the trade, the strength that protects us from enemies. Would you destroy all of that for the sake of sentiment?" It was then that Rurik played his final hand. From his traveling chest, he produced documents that made the entire assembly gasp. Correspondence from raiders planning to attack the village, drawn by reports of its wealth and the weakness of its defenses. "Your prosperity has made us a target," Rurik announced grimly. "These letters were intercepted by my crew 3 days ago. Raiders from the eastern fjords plan to strike before winter, believing that a village divided against itself cannot mount effective resistance." The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembly. Magnus's policies had not only created internal division, they had advertised the village's vulnerability to external enemies. "But there is more," Rurik continued, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had spent his life understanding warfare. "These raiders have been in contact with Magnus himself. They know our defenses, our routines, the location of our greatest treasures." The accusation of treason hung in the air like a death sentence. Magnus's face went white as snow, his carefully constructed image of leadership crashing down around him. "That is impossible," he stammered. "I would never betray your own people." Rurik's voice cut like a blade. "You have been doing nothing else for years. What is one more betrayal when it serves your interests?" The evidence was circumstantial but damning. Messages that revealed detailed knowledge of the village's vulnerabilities, information that only someone with Magnus's access could have provided. Whether he had intended treason or simply been careless with sensitive information mattered little to the assembled villagers. Young Thorvald stepped forward, his voice shaking with emotion. "I call for judgment," he declared, invoking the ancient right of any free man to demand justice. "Let the village decide whether Magnus Thorvaldsson is fit to lead us or whether his crimes demand removal from all authority." The vote was conducted in the traditional manner, each household head casting their decision by placing a stone in one of 2 circles marked before the justice stone. White stones for Magnus, black stones for judgment against him. As the counting proceeded, the verdict became clear. Even many of Magnus's former supporters had turned against him, unable to stomach the evidence of systematic fraud and potential treason. The final tally was overwhelming, fewer than a dozen white stones against more than 60 black ones. Magnus fell to his knees before the justice stone, his authority stripped away by the judgment of his own people. But the assembly's work was not finished. According to ancient law, crimes against the community demanded not just removal from power, but restitution and punishment proportional to the harm done. "The stolen property will be returned to its rightful owners," Rurik announced as the newly recognized voice of justice. "Magnus's personal wealth will compensate those who cannot be fully restored, and Magnus himself will face exile, not death. For even in his crimes he has not shed blood, but banishment from the community he betrayed." It was a sentence both merciful and final. Magnus would live, but he would never again hold power over those he had wronged. His supporters, stripped of their leader and facing potential investigation of their own roles in the fraud, accepted the judgment with sullen resignation. But Rurik's greatest moment came when he turned to address the broader question of how such crimes could be prevented in the future. Standing beside the justice stone, he spoke with the authority of a man who had found his true purpose. "We will establish new customs," he declared, "customs that honor both progress and tradition. No elder will want for basic needs while the community prospers. No voice of wisdom will be silenced by claims of irrelevance, and no leader will hold power without the understanding that true strength comes from protecting the vulnerable, not exploiting them." The assembly roared its approval, recognizing not just the justice of the verdict, but the wisdom of the new path forward. As the stones of judgment were gathered and the formal proceedings concluded, Sigrid approached the justice stone with tears streaming down her face. "It is finished," she whispered, touching the ancient carved surface with reverent fingers. "Justice has been done." But as Rurik looked out over the assembled villagers, young and old, wealthy and poor, all united in their commitment to a more just community, he knew that this was not an ending but a beginning. They had torn down Magnus's corrupt system, but now they faced the harder task of building something better in its place. Spring returned to Ironfjord with unusual warmth, as if the very land itself celebrated the restoration of justice. 6 months had passed since the Great Assembly, and the village bore little resemblance to the divided community that Magnus had ruled through fear and exploitation. Sigrid's new loom sat in the place of honor by her cottage window, its polished wood gleaming in the morning sun. The village women had commissioned it together, not as charity, but as recognition of her skill in weaving the finest cloth in 3 fjords. Her fingers, no longer trembling with hunger and despair, moved across the threads with the sure touch of a master craftsman returning to beloved work. "The young ones are eager to learn," she told Rurik as he paused to watch her work. 3 girls have asked me to teach them the old patterns their grandmothers knew. They say the imported cloth lacks the spirit that makes clothing truly beautiful." It was one of many changes that had transformed daily life in the village. The systematic restoration of respect for traditional skills had created a renaissance of local craftsmanship. Sven's shipyard bustled with activity as young apprentices learned to build vessels that combined the best of old wisdom with new innovations. Gunnar's cottage had become an informal school where children learned not just letters and numbers, but the stories and laws that defined their heritage. The elderly were no longer invisible burdens to be managed or exploited. They had become treasured resources whose knowledge commanded respect and whose welfare was seen as a measure of the community's moral health. The weekly assemblies that Rurik had instituted ensured that their voices were heard in all important decisions, their wisdom sought rather than dismissed. But the changes extended far beyond the restoration of individual dignity. The village's approach to prosperity itself had evolved into something that honored both innovation and tradition. Trade still flourished, but it was balanced by investment in local skills and knowledge. Wealth was still celebrated, but not at the expense of community bonds or the abandonment of the vulnerable. Rurik found himself thinking often of Bjorn's unfinished blade as he walked through the transformed village. The weapon still lay on the anvil in what had become a memorial workshop where young people learned the blacksmith's art. Sigrid had decided to leave it incomplete, a reminder that some legacies were finished not by their original creators, but by those who understood and honored their intentions. The external threat that had helped expose Magnus's treachery had never materialized. The raiders who had planned to attack the village had been intercepted by Rurik's own crew, their ships captured before they could reach the fjord. But their correspondence had served its purpose in revealing the true cost of internal division and weak leadership. Under the new governance structure, a council that included both successful merchants and respected elders, the village's defenses had been strengthened not through fear and exclusion, but through unity and shared purpose. Young warriors trained alongside experienced fighters, learning that true strength came from protecting others rather than dominating them. "Do you ever regret it?" Helga the baker asked Rurik one evening as they shared ale in the great hall. giving up the raider's life for this quieter existence? Rurik considered the question as he watched Sigrid teaching a group of children an ancient song, her voice clear and strong, despite her years. Around them, the hall buzzed with conversation between young and old, merchant and craftsman, all contributing to the community's ongoing prosperity. "I spent my life taking from others," he said finally. "Here, I've learned what it means to build something that will outlast me." The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Some of Magnus's former supporters had left the village rather than accept the new order, taking their wealth but leaving behind the local knowledge and relationships that had made them truly valuable. A few had attempted to recreate Magnus's exploitation in other settlements, only to find that word of their methods had spread faster than their reputations. But most had adapted, discovering that prosperity built on mutual respect and shared obligation was more satisfying than wealth extracted through exploitation. The merchants who had once seen the elders as burdens now recognized them as living libraries whose knowledge made their own ventures more successful. The changes had attracted attention from neighboring villages, many of which were grappling with their own versions of the problems Magnus had created. Delegations arrived regularly to study the new customs and laws that had emerged from the Great Assembly. Some left impressed but unconvinced. Others returned to their own communities with plans for similar reforms. Most importantly for Rurik, the bonds between generations had been not just restored but strengthened. Children who had been taught to see their grandparents as irrelevant relics now competed for the privilege of learning traditional skills and stories. The wisdom of ages was being passed down alongside the innovations of youth, creating a culture that honored both heritage and progress. As winter gave way to spring, and spring moved toward summer, Rurik found his own role in the village evolving. No longer the returning hero or the agent of justice, he had become something he had never imagined possible. A respected elder in his own right, someone whose experience and judgment were valued by those who looked to the future. The silver arm ring that had failed to solve Sigrid's problems in those first desperate days now served a different purpose. Rurik had melted it down and commissioned a new work from the village's young smiths, a series of small medallions that were presented to community members who exemplified the values they had fought to restore. Kindness to the vulnerable, respect for wisdom, generosity toward those in need, courage in defending justice. Sigrid wore the first medallion, its simple design reflecting the hammer that Bjorn had once forged for a frightened child. But she was not alone. Dozens of others had earned recognition for acts of compassion and wisdom that might once have gone unnoticed in Magnus's merit-focused world. On the anniversary of the Great Assembly, the village celebrated not with elaborate festivities, but with a simple ceremony at the Justice Stone. One by one, members of the community placed flowers on the ancient marker, each bloom representing a commitment to the values that had guided their transformation. "We are not perfect," Rurik said as the ceremony concluded, and the villagers began to disperse to their evening meals. "We will make mistakes, face new challenges, struggle with the balance between individual ambition and collective responsibility, but we have proven something important, that communities can change, that justice can prevail, that the strong can choose to protect rather than exploit the vulnerable." Sigrid took his arm as they walked back toward her cottage, her step light despite her years. The bowl that had once held her desperate scraps now served honey cakes to the neighborhood children who came for stories and songs. The forge behind her home rang once again with the sound of honest work, tended by apprentices who learned not just the shaping of metal, but the forging of character. "Bjorn would be proud," she said softly, as they paused to watch the sunset paint the fjord waters gold and crimson. "Not just of what we've accomplished, but of the man you've become." Rurik smiled, touching the small iron hammer that still hung around his neck. No longer a child's keepsake, but a reminder of the love that had shaped him and the legacy he was now helping to build. In the distance, ships moved peacefully across waters that had once carried him toward conquest and glory. Now they carried something far more precious, the promise that kindness could triumph over cruelty, that wisdom could overcome ignorance, and that communities built on love and justice could endure long after individual ambitions had been forgotten. The age of taking was over. The age of giving had begun.